All right, so welcome to our first tech talk of the quarter. Our guest today is T Lachausse. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. He was an editor of Matador Games, and I think it's super fun to bring the journalist's perspective of game development, which is not usually what we get to hear about often. So thanks to Donovan to reaching out to JT, and let's just get started. JT, you can start it out talking about yourself and your experience, and I guess experience not just in working with game devs, but talking to them and even talking about your side of the story in journalism.
Okay, yeah. So hi everybody, it's nice to meet you all. I used to be a master's student at UCR, which is how I met Donovan and Zoe and maybe somebody else in this room. I studied fiction writing while I was at UCR, but when I was an undergrad, I double majored, or really I majored with a hefty minor in writing and game development. So I got to take, and I had a pretty special program where we could actually get our hands on cool technology for game development. So I can talk a little bit about that experience when I was at Columbia College in Chicago. But now I'm doing a PhD in English over here in Milwaukee. So yeah, Matador Review was for about 4 or 5 years, really exciting journal where we interviewed pretty much the editorial team said, who are our heroes? We're going to interview them. And our editorial team was made of writers and game developers. So we took those two things and sort of made a journal that did a bit of a combination of both. We published writing, but we also published interactive fiction type stuff, which was sort of cutting edge when it comes to literary journals. We were trying to give a place to something that was not really in the literary community. Aside from maybe Emily Short, if you're interested in interactive fiction, Emily Short is essential. She's the queen bee of interactive fiction, especially early 2000s. Stuff like what she did was really interesting to us. So we wanted to get our hands on people doing that. But in the process of publishing writers, we also interviewed writers. So we interviewed, just off the top of my head, we interviewed one of the directors for BioWare. His name's John Warner. Very this guy is sort of classic, tie on suit, but he's a game developer, so he's casual, but he's a pro. I mean, he's directing BioWare, and you kind of have to have all of your ducks in a row to be in that position. But we also interviewed Eric Barone pretty shortly after Stardew Valley came out. This is the lone developer of Stardew Valley. Really fascinating guy. This is a guy who dedicated 6 years to making an independent project on his own with the support of his partner, who was in a doctoral program while he was doing that. So I can talk a little bit about what he told us about the independent side of things, because I'm assuming some folks in here want to do, well, all folks in here want to do something with games. Some folks will want to go into the studio side. Some folks might want to go into the independent side. Two very different lifestyles, cultures, rigor. Neither you could say are harder than the other. It's an interesting, I want to say, dichotomy in that industry. And then we interviewed Donna Bailey, who's now a dear friend of mine. She is considered one of the godmothers of gaming. She produced Centipede, the old Atari game, back when Atari was kind of on the rise. And she talked a lot about being one of the few women in gaming, period, and sort of for a while forgotten by game history. And that's no longer the case. Now people are really starting to remember her name and her work as a programmer. I mean, she, at the time, doing what she did with Centipede was cutting edge, incredible computer work. I don't think she would appreciate being called a genius, but I think she's a genius. And then one of the lost interviews that we never published, I can also link some of these to y'all if y'all want to read the content of it, because we're in the process of moving the archive from Squarespace to WordPress. So right now, Squarespace is down, WordPress is in the process of going up. We interviewed the two brothers who made Cuphead, but we didn't publish that interview. That is a fascinating story that I can just tell you kind of what we talked about a little bit. So that's my experience talking to the pros. I myself have worked on a few interactive fiction stuff, and I've been surrounded by game makers, best friends, roommates who went on to work for Blizzard, before acquisition, before a lot of other stuff happened at Blizzard, if you know, you know, and went to work at Telltale, left Telltale because they could see Telltale Games was about to shut down. So I've seen a lot of the drama, and I've also seen somebody, my friend Beck, I saw them work from nothing, from no industry connections, they're a game artist, to being at Blizzard, which is, you know, cream of the crop. If you get at Blizzard, you kind of made it. So that's the basis of what I can feel very confident and give you great information about making or working on games. And then as far as just creative projects go in general, I've worked on enough that I can help give general advice on how to make something that's just an idea, something that exists, that I feel very confident answering questions about. So that's the rant, that's the opening spiel. Any questions that anybody has, we can kind of flow into it.
For sure. I had some general questions, and then we can, I guess, have people just raise their hands and we'll call on them on like what they want. But I'm really curious about that Cuphead interview that you said wasn't published. Did you guys did they talk about their whole process of getting like that game done? Because I'm aware like of a lot of like the different blocks they went through to like get that game even like finished.
Right.
But I think it'd be really interesting to hear like what coming from them, what they're them talking about their experience. Sorry, my words are like everywhere.
It's totally fine. Yeah. Like, I also appreciate that. Do you pronounce your name Lelia? How do you say
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
Okay.
Lelia.
Lelia. So I appreciate that, you know, it's good to read off of things, but I appreciate that you're kind of going off the cuff. I often say cuff, but you're going off the cuff with your questions. I appreciate that. Yeah, so when it comes to these two brothers, I forget their last name. It starts with an M. It's like an Irish last name, if I remember correctly. Anyways, so the 2010s is this very interesting era in indie game development. Something that I would recommend as a good shorthand on how we got here is Indie Game the movie. It does a lot of good work describing what happens in the late 2000s with Braid and Fez and all of these, it's a lot of dudes just working on these games in an era where indie games were not even really a thing, right? It's sort of like the early 80s with movies. If you're a cinema buff, you know that there were indie films before the 80s, but they didn't quite become a thing until the 80s. That's what was happening in the early 2010s. So what's happening with Eric Barone and the Cuphead boys is they saw, oh, there is a massive fan base for indie games. And they probably started in the early 2010s, both of them, on their projects. So it kind of worked like this, like a lot of projects do with the brothers. One brother was an artist, traditional artist, and one brother was sort of a managerial writer / programmer type, and they could combine their forces with a bit of help on the side. Like, I think their cousin was the jazz instrumentalist or the composer who made the music for Cuphead, which is very famous now. And so they kind of just said, the people that we do know that we like working with, what can we do with that? And they made Cuphead, which is just completely, you know, fantastic. But they did not enter that game with all of the skills that they ended with. And that's going to happen when you work on any creative project. So one thing that's particular about the Cuphead project, if you aren't familiar with Cuphead, it's like a sort of a side-scrolling game with a map, with an overview map where you go between levels. But the side-scroller component is a very, very notoriously difficult game where you battle these like fantastical creatures. It's a 2D, traditionally drawn, animated in the style of old Mickey Mouse cartoons. Very fun, very addictive. And they had this vision because they loved that rubber style animation of those old cartoons. They wanted to make a game out of it. So I think they started in their late 30s. They've already had pretty long careers doing other stuff. So they had money, they had resources to take some time to work on this. But of course, like, they didn't have infinite money and infinite resources. So there were sacrifices made. I don't want to speak too much on their process because I might get some details wrong. But I know that they had to learn how to take traditional drawing. They drew every single frame by hand and put it into a computer system to make it, digitally playable as it is now. And I think what their story really tells you is, one, if you, I don't know, y'all are all pretty young, so maybe you don't feel this way, but if you at all feel like you're too late starting anything, it's just not the case at all. Like, you have these guys who started making games in their late 30s, early 40s, and they made a cult classic. So you can have a dream of wanting to draw, or a dream of learning how to program these incredible experiences, and you can turn that into reality, but it takes a lot of time, a lot of resources. That's really what I can remember about the Cuphead guys. And I think the fascinating part to me is that they were like, oh, and we happen to have this cousin who composes jazz. And if you play Cuphead, you'll recognize that the game is incredible, but the music takes it from a very good game to the cult classic that it is. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your response.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. One more question. Sorry, it's just because recently I've gotten really, really obsessed with Stardew Valley. So I would love to hear about like how like Eric Barone described his like process of like just working on a game by himself for that many years. And I know currently he's working on like a new game as well. So I'd love to hear about like how, I guess, if he ever talked about like his motivation for continuing to work on Stardew Valley till it became actually like shipped out and published. I'd love to hear more about like that interview.
Yeah. And then I see Crystal's talking about Haunted Chocolatier, which is really exciting. It's going to be a super fun addition to that universe. So Eric Barone was, before the process of making Stardew Valley, he was a computer guy who made music. He's a very good musician. So he played a lot of jazz, played a lot of like heavy metal type stuff, somewhere in between those two. But his fascination since he was a child was Harvest Moon, and he was always obsessed with this idea of this very particular vision of his own Harvest Moon. And that's where Stardew Valley was born out of, was that like that vision, that dream, from what I understand, from what I remember. And so he started creating it in somewhere in the early 2010s while he was still working. I think he worked for 1 or 2 years before he quit his job to focus on Stardew Valley. And in the process of those first, I think even 3 to 4 years, he scrapped the project numerous times. He got really far with the art or really far with the systems. And then he said, whatever, I'm restarting it. Because he was kind of just listening to his gut. When you have a creative vision, when you have something at that scale, your gut begins to become an instinct. If I'm trying to remember as he was explaining it, when he was betraying his vision, or when he was betraying the final vision of what he wanted, he had to step back and he had to restart. And I thought that was really interesting. He made compromises with time, with scale, with certain limitations, but he never compromised the actual vision of Stardew Valley, which is why it's so beloved, because it's a passion project that somebody put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into, with support from his partner, which I thought was a very important detail. He was iterating a lot during the interview. So publishing it, if I remember correctly, he tried to publish it through purely independent means for a while, but he needed a lot of help. And so he reached out to Cuttlefish, I think is their name. He was a publisher, and they helped a lot, help him with programming stuff. So I think the key sort of thread here so far with the Cuphead Boys and Eric Barone is, at a certain point in the process, they knew that they could not do this alone, and that it required a bit of a community or somebody else. Eric Barone never left his building, his apartment, to make Stardew Valley, so he was reaching out virtually, because you could do that now. Cuphead, they would run around downtown, wherever they were, and they would go fetch people that they knew, bring them in, they would help them in person. But it's possible to make an entire game from your setup, with connecting with other people's setups, freelancing, whatever, making a community off of some chat room, whatever you do. you can make something happen that way too. But I think community is super important. No man is an island, that phrase, no person is an island, you know. So if you're thinking about making a game completely on your lonesome, Eric Barone is an inspiration because he did create it on his own. He's 99.99% of the process, but there was some help along the way. So configure that into your dream, essentially. Don't isolate yourself. Don't silo yourself. Getting help is, so maybe it may be anxiety inducing if you're a little bit like me, asking for help, saying, hey, I have this big project, especially if you're afraid of your ego. You're like, I have this really big project and I have this insane dream. Don't think that I'm crazy for asking for help, produce this thing. Just the worst you can get is no. And most times you're not going to get no. Something to consider. So that's my spiel on Stardew Valley.
Yeah, thank you so much for your response.
Thing I thought was pretty interesting is when you mentioned Cuttlefish, because I actually remember that company because it's a British publisher and they published a game called Wargroove that I used to play a lot.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that was a pretty cool connection. I didn't know that right away.
Yeah, I mean, and also the fact that you bring up it's a British company just continues to open that door of like reach out to anybody. Like Eric Barone is Seattle, Washington, and he was like, you know what? And he played another game that they produced, a big game. I don't remember what the game is. Maybe it's the one you're talking about. But and that's how he knew of them. He's like, oh, they're British, whatever. And look, now they're bound. Eric Barone and Cupfish.
Yeah. The other game I can think of is called Starbound, I believe.
Yes.
I don't know a lot about it, but I've heard of it from the same company.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard good things about that one.
Yeah. So I guess pretty interesting thing for me is how did you turn this passion for talking to various game devs into like being a member of especially the editor-in-chief of Matador?
Yeah, so Matador started, this is something that I will make a general recommendation to. I'm a tiny bit of a upwardly mobile cynic, as in, I think everything is a little rigged, but I'm gonna play it, but I'm gonna be honest while playing it. So that's a preface to what I'm about to say. Editing a large scale journal takes out a lot of my time and energy, but I love interviewing people. So editing pieces, getting fiction, nonfiction, poetry, I love reading, but actually combing through thousands of submissions, helping people clean up their typos, clean out their stories, you know, form their poetry, that really exhausted me. And it wasn't the best experience at all times, just emotionally. And working with writers, because writers can be notoriously difficult. But the journal project, the interview process was the thing that saved the magazine experience for me. So I knew that that was the thing I needed to hold on to push me through. But the reason Matador came into existence was because I knew I needed some clout. It also would give me experience. I knew that by the time I was finished doing half a decade of this journal, which was the original plan, I'd be able to walk away and be like, I have 5 years of doing this. If you give me a 10,000 word fiction piece, I will have it back to you in one night. And it won't be, this is the sign of a good editor, by the way. And something that I really want to talk about before we go is the role of a producer, which might speak to maybe 1 or 2 people in this room, but I hope I can change somebody's career thoughts by selling you on the role of the producer. It's one of the most essential roles in all creative projects. But anyways, I knew that when I left Matador, I would have all of this stuff behind me and that I could work efficiently, well, and most importantly, working on somebody else's project is a very sensitive thing, and you have to be able to abide by their vision. The only way that you can train that muscle of locating somebody else's vision is by being empathetic, listening a lot, but also a lot of experience, right? So you may have a best friend and you're talking to them about your huge project and they're like, no, that sounds too much like this, you know, whatever, you know how the conversations can go. It's not that they are being cruel. It has to do a lot with, it takes a certain language skill to reinterpret somebody else's words innocently, or not innocently, but with a clean, from your own clean slate. Don't project your own visions and creative input on it. Try to see what they want to achieve. So that was one thing I really wanted from Matador. I knew I wanted to come out the other end being able to do that, because I knew that one day I wanted to work on group projects. I'm a very group project oriented person. I love teaching. All of my classes were pretty much just group projects. By the end of the sub-quarters, it was like everybody knew what they were doing. I didn't have to say much. And then most importantly, honestly, it was clout. I knew I could get jobs. I got a lot of jobs from Matador. I got a lot of connections through Matador. We did maybe 100 interviews with a bunch of different people. And I'll say this, I told this to some of my students. This is something that aside from the producer thing I want to talk about, this is number 2. I am the first person in my family to go to any school, let alone getting a PhD. First person to move away from my hometown, grew up in trailer trash, Texas, whatever. I hold that as I'm proud of it, but not like Texas proud, just if you know what I'm saying. I'm just sort of proud of where I come from. So asking very famous people to listen to me ask them questions was like a huge, scary ego thing. I was like, oh my God, I shouldn't be the one to do this. I'm not from this culture, whatever. But I decided to just ask people. In the very first issue of Matador, it was me and 2 friends. We all come from that same hometown. We were like, let's just ask the people that we love. So we asked the guy who wrote Lemony Snicket. He wrote the series of Unfortunate Events. We loved him growing up. So we asked him and he said yes, because he liked our energy. He was like, I just love the way that you guys asked me. It was very like innocent, because our interview, he does not do interviews. I don't know if you know this guy, but when he does do interviews, they're pretty, he's gotten in trouble, but before he got in trouble, we were able to interview him. And we got a ton of other people, really, really exciting people, like when I was a teenager, and still kind of now. There's the band, the Mountain Goats. We got to interview the singer of the Mountain Goats. Also, he hates interviews. Joyce Carol Oates, big writer, we got to interview. So these are people, it's sort of like name dropping, but I'm saying this because there was no way in hell any of these people would say yes. And then they did, and we didn't have to pay them. You usually do, because we explained our situation and who we are and what we do. So I say all of this because when you're making a game, you have heroes, and you have people you want to work with, or you need press, just ask. Some of them will say no. We've gotten some pretty bad no's. We've got people who are like, you're not even a print magazine. Why would we even talk to you? And we're like, all right, like that's okay, whatever. I guess that's, that's fine. And then you get people who are like, hell yeah, like interview me right now. Salt on the wound, right? So essentially make opportunity for yourself at every single step of the way. And you're going to get humbled along the way, because you're going to get told no, you're going to get made fun of. And that's kind of the fun part. Once you get past the first few, you're like, oh, like let's see what kind of creative no I'm going to get next time. But when you get the yeses, it's so worth it. So yeah, okay, that's the general thing with that. So I kind of want to like just ask generally, and then I'll get another question. Who do we have, like people who, I guess you could use little emoji responses. Do we have people who want to do art in here? I guess I'm going to separate, like because in games, there's game art, there's the programming, there's the development side, sort of production writing, and then there's sound, audio engineering. Most people don't include that. I don't know why, but that's a whole, I don't know if you've ever been in a game studio. Oftentimes it's 3 times larger than the development side of things. It's huge. The audio side is massive in a lot of cases, unless they freelance from somebody's, a specialist. So I kind of just want to hear a little bit about what all of y'all want to do. I kind of want to get a scope of the room. So are there like artists in here? How would you describe what you want to do, where you're at, whether it's 2D, 3D, technical art, which are like the program artists, right? Lelia, you're an artist.
Yeah, feel free to like raise your hands or speak also.
Yeah. And anyone here who is also like doing creative things, you guys can feel free to talk as well. I'm currently doing 2D art. I've gone more drawn towards pixel art. Maybe it's like kind of an influence of Stardew Valley on me, not gonna lie. Because of like the art assets on there, I think are like really nice. And it's like interesting to see how so much can be conveyed by like just this little like 16 by 16 sprite. But I do like, I can also animate through pixel art. I'm trying to animate through 2D. It's not easy. Doing like full panels of tradition of animation, like drawing frame by frame. Especially since I'm self-taught in all of these, I'm not really taking any like traditional courses. Closest thing would be like looking at YouTube tutorials, trying to figure out how to use the program better, or more efficiently, or just copying what they do. And I guess it's a little worrisome for me because I'm going to graduate soon and I'm still trying to figure out what I really want to do. I do have like kind of a portfolio, but I'm also worried like, should I even keep pursuing a career in game dev, or should I just stick with my major? This is the kind of thing that's floating in my head recently.
What's your major?
I'm a psychology major.
Psychology. Great.
And yeah.
Well, first off, I'll let, as far as your major goes, like, you know, whatever, you know, like, I mean, like, yes, like, not dismissing anybody's major in here. Obviously, I've been in school for quite some time, and I've been doing the same sort of major for quite some time. But your major is you become an expert in a thing, and you can use that expertise in any field. So, for instance, the two friends who made BioWare are sort of a little bit like the Cuphead guys. They worked in medicine for 20 years, I think. These are the founders of BioWare. This is like 90s BioWare, before Mass Effect, before Dragon Age. They worked on Neverwinter Nights, Baldur's Gate, the BioWare Jedi stuff way back in the day. But they loved games, and then suddenly, and they were computer guys as well. They were like computer medicine, sort of a fusion of that. And then like in their 40s, they were like, you know what? I'm gonna go do this. And they found a way to take all of this stuff that they knew and move it into video game world, which was a very clunky, strange industry at that time. They lived in Canada, so it might have been a little different than what I'm familiar with, but sure, it was quite similar. So your major, and BioWare's huge. I mean, they maintained being independent from EA for quite some time. They did their own thing for a long time. And so the major is just, you know, use your major. If you feel unconfident, if you feel like you're a lost soul, I mean, you can kind of figure that out early though. But maybe that's a little, maybe I spent a little bit too much time with my hippie friends in California, but I feel like your gut can really tell you. If you sit for a while, if you journal, I'm a writer, so I have to recommend it, but if you sit and you say something in your head, what does your gut respond with? Like, yeah, like I'm going to spend my life making video games, or I'm going to spend the foreseeable future making video games. I'm going to proceed for the foreseeable future building a security network for myself until I'm 35. I'm going to work, you know, so that's what my partner is doing. So he wants to work in video games. He's exceedingly proficient in computers. He works for Northwestern, the insurance company. He's making good money, and this is his whole plan. He's like, when I'm 35, I'm done. And he's like been counting down the years. And he has this huge savings, and when he's done, he wants to make, he wants to work with games, so that's in the industry or solo, whatever. So I will say, Lelia, about pixel art is, I think that's really fascinating. And pixel art can go a lot of places. So the people who worked on Hades, some of the artists from Hades were pixel art proficient before they were whatever the hell all of that was. I mean, like, that's a game of another level. It's deceptively simple. When you look at Hades, if you play Hades, which I recommend to everybody, it's not even my type of game. I'm a baby gamer. I need easy games. I need very easy. I need The Sims. But Hades is so fascinating because it's just so, it's sort of, it's an indie game made by an indie team, and it really took so much to the next level as far as technical expertise, art, writing, because it's sort of like, I'm tired of mythology. If any of you are creative writing or English majors, you have been told the Greek Roman myths over and over and over and over since like maybe middle school. It's very exciting stuff. We like to talk about it. It's fun. You can't deny those characters are so fun. But you're kind of like, you want something new. You want something fresh, something exciting, some different mythologies. They completely revamped it. Yeah, the Norse gods, them too. Exactly. Right. I mean, yeah, what is it? God of War helped sort of push the Norse stuff even for Viking stuff. Maybe I'm getting it wrong. Yeah, the Hades script is really insane. Okay, so the art thing, I will say this, because I lived with Beck and I saw Beck hustle. I don't think there was a single night that they weren't up. Their whole goal was that 10,000 hours thing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but if you do something for 10,000 hours, you're considered a master. This is Beck. This is how they work. So every night they would come home from school, they would do a little work, and then they would sit down with their tablet with some good music on or a podcast, and they would do the same thing that they had been doing for 2 months, which is a rendering of something, or making something into a vector, or doing this into that, whatever. And it was that and that and that, and they just became a technical expert. They knew how to solve every sort of artistic issue in 2D. They didn't even do animation; they just did 2D. So that's one way of sort of maybe building industry within yourself, being industrious, is this sort of like being comfortable becoming mechanical with some of your skills, sitting down and just practicing the basics until you really, really muscle memory know them. And that goes for all things. Programming a extremely effective, simple game takes a very, very, very long time. But if you can really make it clean, you walk away knowing how to solve. I mean, it's kind of like your geometry in art. If you don't know, and geometry sounds simple, it's very difficult when it comes to understanding perspective in art, et cetera, et cetera. But once you know it, you can solve a lot of mathematical problems within art, programming, whatever. And then for the folks who do art, but are also like programmers, I recommend looking into something called technical art. It's sort of a very specialist field, but it's like art that has programming embedded into it. Responsive art. That's going to be a thing as we move along into artificially intelligent art. When you think of artificial intelligence, you think about mechanics, right? About programming. It's starting to become like the art department and the programming department are starting to do this in a weird way, in a way that we thought that they were on other ends of the industry. Anyways, okay, so that's a little bit about art. I will say this, I'll get some blanket statements out. Don't take anything as rule of thumb, especially if you're doing indie art. But if you think about if you're wanting to do studios, this is for all careers. Go find an old or especially new job application for the studio that you would dream to work at one day, and look at the requirements that they're asking for, and just build a gentle system for yourself for moving toward that. They're going to say you need 5+ years and you need to ship 3 AAA games and blah, 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 and all that stuff. And it sounds very intense and whatever. You can do it. It's fine. But kind of just say, okay, what do I need to do to achieve that? For some folks, it's going to be the prospect of moving away from home. You might be able to work from home for some of these studios. But a lot of it's going to be about, we need you to work at a AAA studio. And a lot of AAA studios, you have to work in there. You have to go live in Vancouver. You have to go live near Austin, Texas, wherever you're going to go work. Santa Monica, if you want to do like a Last of Us type thing. They're all going to ask for you to live there. You're going to have to get up and move. And they're going to ask for a certain expertise and blah, blah, blah. So that's just one thing I recommend to think about in the back of your head is, in 2 or 3 years or in 6 months or whatever, am I going to be comfortable going solo and living in a completely new place, working a part-time job, coming back home just so I can intern at this place or, make minimum wage? Something to also remember is that the game company is still in the tech industry. The tech industry has very interesting standards for how they treat their workers. I say that so that I don't go into a rant, but something to think about. If you're hard-headed like I am, don't give that up. Just get ready to go in there and do what you need to do to make sure you're being treated fairly. Because a lot of companies are getting completely brought down to their knees for treating their employees very poorly. And it's only because those employees were vocal that, yeah, that they were able to do that. So know what you're getting into and just, be a bit fearless. But definitely go look at those job applications to see what they expect. Like Lelia was talking about portfolios earlier, build an insane portfolio. Beck sent out their portfolio to a ton of people, not applying, just for recommendations, how to make it better. And they got so much good advice that when they sent it to Telltale Games, Telltale was like, yeah, like, done deal. We're hiring you, we're flying you out to California. And Beck got up and moved, went to Telltale and was like, I don't like the way you run your company. And this is 4 months before Telltale was shutting down. This also just shows how smart Beck is. Beck was like, I don't know if it's your fault or the parent company, but something's not right. I'm leaving, but can y'all give me a letter of recommendation to Blizzard? And they were like, oh, we hate to see you go, but sure. And they got the job at Blizzard. So just be an opportunist. Programming. There was a question on that sheet that was sent to me, sort of like a list of questions about programming languages. I will say that it changes a lot. What language you need to know really changes depending on the game. Eric Barone learned completely new coding languages just to change the game's look, just to change the way the game functioned. So again, look at requirements for jobs and see what they're talking about when it comes to programming languages. The thing is that I work as a web developer for my school, so I see not a lot, but I see several different languages with coding, doing whether it's interactive website building or just basic static website. Once I learned one language and kind of how they worked, you can get the others. So if you're new to programming but you want to do programming in games, just go work on WordPress and HTML, move to Java, move to CSS, move to C+, keep moving, just keep going and you're fine. You're gonna be able, once you can get one, you can absolutely get the others. Have full confidence in that. Okay, so that's art and programming. The thing about the art and programming people in video games is they already know all of this because it's abundantly clear what those two things do, right? In most cases. Here's the tricky part. So I did game development at Columbia College. So this is what we learned is if you want to be a writer in video games, that is for the foreseeable future, not a job. You don't really get hired as a writer. You get hired as on the development team. And the development team are typically people who have programming experience. And so, for instance, you will be writing dialogue. Sometimes if it's a huge game, like the next Dragon Age or like The Last of Us, or even those like character heavy battle MMOs with all of y'all know what I'm talking about. Overwatch, they will bring in writers to build very, very special, lovable characters because they make the trailers. They do League of Legends, like that too. That's a very famous one. All of the characters and the long histories that they have, right? If you've ever played League of Legends, even once, for one day, you can tell that there are all of these unique relationships and histories, right? Writers were hired freelance, I think, for a lot of the website stuff and a lot of those things. But if you want a permanent job at a studio as a writer, you're probably going to be a developer. And developers tend to make like a lot of the systems that then go to the programmers. So that's like the weapons that you're doing. How do the weapons function? How do the weapons apply to your characters? What are you doing with those weapons? What level do you get those weapons? They're defining a lot of the characteristics of the game in a way that you would think the programmers do. The programmers are programming. They're not inventing the material for the game, right? So if at level 30, you can finally wield the mega sword, whatever, that was not a programmer who came up with that. That was a developer. So that's a whole team. So I wanted to clear that out. If there's anybody who wants to do writing, get good at math for the video game world. It's a strange thing to tell writers to get good at math, but just do it. And you can, even if you weren't taught well in high school, like me, Texas education didn't do a good job with math. I taught myself, it's fine. And another thing about development is really I would recommend the best thing that you can do is download and something like Twine or anything like that, where you make a game with minimal coding and you're doing all of these branching paths and you have to pay a lot of attention to numbers and character progression and stuff like that. It's going to teach you the basics of how to create an experience with meaningful decisions. That's what games do. Even if it's not like a RPG, right, exactly. Twine is very essential for writer devs. Even if it's not an RPG, if it's just an action game, and you know that when you fight something once, the next time that enemy comes back, they're going to be twice as powerful. You have to think about that and how that's going to be experienced by the player, right? Right, there's just so much, and I don't want to go over an hour, but there's just a lot to it. Again, look at job requirements. Okay, so this is I'm going to look at the chat too, so I don't forget any questions that were asked.
Yeah, there was a question from Crystal. It was a little further up, I believe, when you scroll up.
Is it the producer one? Because I was about to get into
Yes.
production. Okay, great. So production, and then I'll do audio real quick for the audio people. So here's the thing about producers. This is first for everybody, and then I will zero in on the producer. If you are working on a creative project that you plan on having 3 or more people, that might sound drastic, but 3 or more people, you need a producer. That's it. And 3 more people includes freelance. That includes reaching out to anybody, especially if you plan on making money from your game and you're freelancing people, so you'll be dealing with contracts, I would think. You need a producer. And the producer is not a role that a lot of people have just experience offhand with. But what a producer, so let's just say this, right? Let's make an imaginary scenario. Somebody in here who does art, somebody does programming, somebody does the development, and somebody does the sound. You have 4 people coming together and they say, we want to make a game that is sort of quirky and very well written, has fun sound. You're thinking of like an Undertale, smaller scale, but your own thing. Okay. You have all these people who become invested in their craft and they have their own sort of divisions of labor. And if any conflict happens, it becomes one craft talking to another craft. It's a very interesting thing I'm trying to ask everybody, because I've experienced this a lot. You have an artist, the art of a game, essentially, is now arguing with the development of the game. That's when the producer steps in. The producer's job is to be clear and to see something through. The producer's job is conflict management. The producer's job is time management, money management. Okay, this is what makes something actually happen. So, and producers a lot of times end up becoming or come from one of those artistic fields. Here's an example. I'm producing an audio drama, which is for an indie audio drama, medium budget, which is pretty big. And we hire a lot of original composers. We hired all of our actors, all of our artists, everything for the show. And we only were able to do all of this because we have a producer who has the time and clarity to say, okay, so this is the second to last episode. We need to hire a composer so that we can build hype for the second season. We need to have this, we need to have that. I've seen so many projects fall apart or not finish because there wasn't a producer. So for the producers, here's what I say. If you're somebody who just loves art and you love art so obsessively, it doesn't even really matter if you are the person creating it. This is a very specific person I'm talking about, because most art lovers who want to make art are obsessed with making art. And that's like me. So I'm not a producer. But there are people who are not like that and who are like, no, I want to see art succeed in the world. And they're very good at conflict management and sort of making Excel spreadsheets, like those obsessive people who know how to make that phone call and be like, hey, what's up? You know, casual conversation, and then be like, by the way, that deadline was a week ago. Are you okay? Do you need an extension? Those kind of people, producers are very necessary and are a much, if you go look at any studio company right now, if there is an opening, I guarantee you it's for one of two things. An artist for an upcoming mobile game or a producer. Those are the two roles that are always open for video game companies, because producers, a good producer is hard to find, but once you find one, your career is set. I mean, and in a lot of ways, production people, they get their degrees all over the place, just like game people. I mean, like the original game developers were just people who knew how to work with computers a little bit. Yeah, artists for mobile games is the number one thing that's always open, because they're very short-lived, those jobs, for a lot of the time, because they're not AAA games, right? So producer, really, you just have to start being a person who works with everybody. So if you're in this room and you're one of the people who's thinking about being a producer, start looking at the projects that are being talked about here and see if you can get your hands on them within the projects and see and make them come to fruition and say, hey, could I help produce this project? You don't have to, there's a term called executive producer. It was the people who fund projects. That's not what I'm talking about. The producer is the person who gets deadlines together, manages team morale, blah, 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 all of that. Very important for indie projects. If you work on indie projects and you see them to fruition and you're listed as a producer slash voice, because our producer for our audio drama is also the voice of the villain and is also one of the people who does a little bit of the writing, you're probably going to end up doing some art. But if you're listed as the producer, people are going to ask, what did you do? What experiences do you have? And that's really going to boost your chances. So here's the secret for producers. There's something in the game industry, this is for the people who want to do the industry, called lead artist, lead designer, lead programmer. These are the people who have the creative vision for something in a game and then lead the team into doing it. If you want to get those roles, you kind of also have to have production experience. So never did an interview with him, but I've talked to him enough. There's a guy named Josh Sawyer. He was the creative director for Fallout New Vegas. He made Pillars of Eternity and Pillars of Eternity Deadfire. Really fascinating dude, super cool, also from Wisconsin. I'm not from Wisconsin, I'm just here now. He talks a lot about how he became the lead developer for Fallout New Vegas, which is a cult classic, huge game. What he knew going into Fallout was he knew a lot about guns, he knew a lot about Christian mythology, and he knew a lot about meaningful decisions in games. That was his shtick. He's going into the Fallout universe, right? The Holy Trinity, right? Very Wisconsin. But he goes in and he says there's this beloved series, Fallout 1 and 2, were these like isometric wonder kinds of the 90s. And then you have Fallout 3, which was this Bethesda masterwork. At the time, it was incredible that a world could look that way. And then an independent studio hired him to help make Fallout New Vegas, which is this like wacky Western RPG about somebody who dies and gets brought back from the dead by a robot. That's a very rough explanation. If you've ever played the game, you know I'm underselling it. But he had led small teams as a developer for a while, doing production, coming in as like almost a contract job and being like, you need to organize your team better. You need to be way nicer to your programmers. You need to cool it on your artists, or your developers are doing half the job they should be, you know, that kind of thing. All of that experience took him away from actually doing development. And it might have seemed like a waste of time, but in the end, it made him a team master, working with all these people making sure that a vision can go from just scratch paper notes to something that actually worked out. Yeah, so production can go one or two ways. You can always be a producer. And for that, I recommend going into, what is it? Like going into the game industry, you probably do, unless you're working on indie and you always want to do indie and you don't necessarily want to make a living from production, you just want to make things happen, then you know what to do. It's in your heart. If you want to work in the studio, go in there and probably do user feedback, like working on, what's that called? It's like the entry level thing where you're working with bugs and things like that. So you're going to go work in like bug management, fixing games, tweaking with them, kind of being a jack of all trades, getting paid pretty little. But those jobs can go anywhere you want after that. And then for the audio designers, really, whether a musician, whether you're I do the sound design for my show, you just have to work on things all the time and you'll figure out how to make something sound good and interesting. If you're a musician, I can't really give you any advice there. Musicians are musicians, you know, learn whatever program is hot right now. But a lot of programmers do sound programming. That's every time the blade hits, you have a response. If it hits harder, you have a different response, things like that. And I also don't know too much about that, but I look at job requirements and see if you can get your hands on programs and work with a team where you can play with those things. Okay, so that's my all of the fields of gaming rant. Are there any questions that I missed or any questions that you have before we have to close out?
Oh, I had one question. So for as a programmer, is there any other like kind of side project, like personal project you could work on besides like making your own game or being part of a team that's currently developing a game?
Yeah, did you say as a co-writer?
Yeah, co-writer or programmer.
Yeah, I think all the time you can be. Depends on, you know, how, if you have a project that you're working on and you also have a personal project, that's doable. But you just have to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, you're getting your rest, you know, all that stuff. Again, I'm thinking about the producer here. A good producer would know, Garrett. They would be able to talk to you and be like, so what's going on? Oh, that's great. You have another project. Are you doing good on time? So yeah, make sure that you are fulfilling your creative needs, Garrick, at all times. So if you're working on a project, but you know in your heart of hearts that your personal project is the thing that's going to make waking up tomorrow that much better, that much easier, or that much, you know, not necessarily easier, but just more fun, then you can change how much time you spend on one or the other. Sometimes you have to make those sacrifices where you say, I'm new to this, so I need experience and I need connections. So I'm going to put my project on the side and I'm going to work on this group thing. I thought about that a lot. Working on this audio drama, I do sound design and it takes, and I get no money for it. It takes 25 hours a week. I also work a part-time job and do the PhD program and have a life. And I don't breathe much, but I'm very efficient. I'm a Capricorn as well. So I get my schedule out and I'm timing everything every day. 5 hours doing this, 2 hours taking a nap, 1 hour eating and talking to my mom. You just kind of have to experiment to figure out how it's all going to work for you.
Thank you for that advice.
Of course. Any other questions? And I think it's 6:59, so we could probably officially wrap up. But if you have any one-on-one questions that aren't general that you wanted to ask, I can hang around for a little bit.
Speak now, or
Yeah, anybody, I'll give everybody first chance.
What was that? I feel like I missed it.
Just giving everybody like a chance to speak before I have my question.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So does anybody have a question before it's officially over? I guess it's officially over now. So if anybody needs to go, you know, this is the point where you're like, oh, I can dip out and I won't feel guilty for leaving. You know, I feel like it's 7 o'clock now. It's been an hour, so it's been nice meeting all of you, talking to some of you. But if you have any one-on-ones or you want to wait to hear the one-on-ones, hang around. I'll answer some questions for a little bit.
Personally, I think that what you talked about for the past hour was really cool. Like, dude, you talk to the Cuphead people. That's really cool, man. Like, wow. So yeah, thanks for spending your past hour here.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, honestly.
Yeah, this was amazing. Like being able to like invite you here, like what is it, like 2 years after I had your class?
Yeah, and Donovan, I don't know if you remember, but like Donovan, you're like really, you probably already did this, but in my class, at the very end, the one thing that I really emphasized is that community is the thing that will make being an artist survivable. And if you become alone or isolated, which sometimes is not the fault of yourself, you have to give yourself a break. Sometimes we have really bad years or even a decade of just being isolated. But getting back out there and being with the community and working with people and talking to people, whether it's online or in person, is what makes it all happen. And so like I remember after our class, Donovan, you were still talking with everybody and you were still kind of always in the flow of things, which I thought was great. And I'm excited to see what you do.
Yeah, I was pretty interested to see like how, like, you know how we had the like the writer roundtable like once a week. I was surprised like that kept going all the way into like November of the following school year. Like that was like that small community, like we kept it going for quite a while after that class. So it was like obviously it made it like well memorable.
Yeah, I might jump into that Slack channel one day and just say, hey, like, how are y'all doing? And see if anybody gets the alert. But yeah.
Yeah, I haven't been on the Slack channel lately. I know I did add, I added, I think a couple people on Discord actually. And we like continued a little bit on Discord.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay, so are there any other questions or anecdotes? Like, are there like personal experiences that anybody had that they wanted to like bring up? Like as specific things that they had a challenge with or a question about?
Speak now.
I have one question, unless anybody wants to speak first. Going once, going twice. Okay.
Yeah,
so
go for it.
I'm an editor for 2 of the games that are currently in production with GameSpot. Well, actually, I pretty much finished the editorial process for both of them at this point. And I was wondering, what are some suggestions that you would have for like building up like editorial skills on a professional level going forward?
So how were you editing? What were you editing as far as the game goes?
So I was editing the scripts that were being written. So both of the lead writers would send me the script. I would apply like comments, especially anything that I believe like the story can like clarify or elevate, or like maybe some characters don't get a lot of screen time. So maybe there's a suggestion, hey, this character, maybe they can be more important, give them a name. They can exist as somebody unique instead of just a nameless like AI, basically. So I've been doing things like that, especially for one of the projects that doesn't have a set amount of characters, and then one of the other ones, it has a set small cast of characters. So I give comments about like how these characters can maybe like add more tension or conflict or things along those lines.
That's smart. Yeah. So you're wondering, and Donovan, like when you want experience as an editor, are you hoping to get experience because you want to take your editorial experience into gaming, or you want to take it into a literary field?
I'm hoping, so this is going, I don't know exactly, but I know I do want to build these skills. So I'm leaning more towards what if I can do this for video games, because this is what I already do for the game club, even though like every single job I've had has been tied to video editing or whatever. So that's more or less along my interests.
So I'll say this. So my generation, my weirdo generation, the millennials, are those like one-track minded people who do like one industry and that's it, but they do it in such a very niche way that it kind of isolates them from a lot of jobs. The good thing about Gen Z, it seems to be so far, is y'all don't have any issue hopping around and trying things out. And I think that's very essential. So I built my editing skills at different places. I edited for a creative journal. You can do that online, Donovan, and I can also send you places that I've interned at if you're interested. That was creative interning. I would get a fiction, nonfiction piece, comb through, clean it up. Sometimes I didn't really do suggestions. I just did the grammar and the spelling. I've done journalism. I worked at Indies Times, which is this progressive newspaper in Chicago. That was hard, very hard. If you want to really get good at quick editing, like the technical, intern at a newspaper, you will come out a whole different person. So that's if you want to do literary or just the basic fundamental skills of editing at the technical level. If you want to get good at editing creatively, yes, do the literary journals, but also continue doing exactly what you're doing. And if you want to take that into the game industry, they aren't really going to know what that means on the resume. So I would try to make that skill you have editing creatively into a production role. So start, instead of saying I'm editing for this, ask people if you can be a producer and make that your core job. So they'll know, right? Like whoever you just did your editing for, ask them if you can just be listed as a producer. I doubt they're going to care because it doesn't mean anything. You know, it's not going to take money or any prestige away. So that's going to help you with the games industry. And you did do production because that's what the producers I know for games did. They went in and said, this game seems a little like this character who's supposed to be the villain, you only meet once, and I get you're trying to build suspense, but they don't even know who this person is whenever they finally meet them again. So we need to do something about that. So just kind of as you move along, don't stress too much about, oh God, what field am I moving toward? Just get the experience. And I would say, just for being safe, go ahead and think about that editor job for games as a producer job. Start saying, oh, I'm doing production, which I'm helping them by editing, maybe some other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so funny thing how I asked that because the one of the writers is actually Zoe. She's in this chat with us. So yeah, I worked on her game for I believe it's a year and a half at this point.
Ooh.
Yeah. So pretty large project, pretty long scripts, but it was definitely really interesting to see like a long form story as opposed to like workshopping in a single short story in a fiction class.
Wow. Yeah, I would love to see what y'all end up doing. If y'all remember to send it my way, I'd love to see some of the stuff. Not the work in progress, of course, but if y'all have your beta versions out or whatever, I'd love to see it because that sounds really exciting. Yeah, leads. At a certain level in all industries, the titles become very rigid because of history or unionization and stuff like that. So for instance, like you in the film industry, you can be called a PA, a production assistant, and that covers a lot of different things, but you're only called a production assistant officially if you're covered by the Screen Actors Guild. If you're not covered by the Screen Actors Guild, you're technically called something else, like an intern or a stagehand, like weird, right? It's just titles. So in the game industry, at a studio, if you are at a certain level, you're just called lead artist. But in fact, the lead artist in a lot of, especially at Rockstar, let's say, they are doing everything. Like they're doing absolutely everything. They're not only making art, but they're also like building a new room. They're doing construction. They're doing plumbing. Like it's just like crazy, like the stuff that they do. So yes, the answer to the question is at a certain level, yeah, you are a producer. Everyone is a producer at a certain level. I just think it's a good habit for everybody to have anyways. Learn how to produce yourself first and take care of yourself, set time and, to get work done, stuff like that. And, yeah, the best lead developers, especially the lead developers, are good producers. I don't know a single lead developer in gaming that was not also a good producer. Because you're just leading a team of a ton of creative writers and systems builders, and you have to make all of that cohere into a vision, and you have to say no to people, which is really hard. Like if you have any teams in this room, just imagine somebody bringing you a creative take and you have to say no. Like that's just, it sucks. It's really hard. But that's what the producer does, is they just contribute to the clarity of the whole vision, and they know how to say it because they're speaking true, we're making a Norse mythology game. We can't randomly have somebody come in with a cell phone unless it's futuristic. I don't know. But yeah, the answer is for that is yes. But for people who want to be a producer, I have not been one. I mean, I have some production skills, but for the radio show that we produce, the producer is named Ann Hughes. And if anybody has questions about production, and you want very practical, specific answers to take with you, I guess, how can we do this? Drop your email, I'll copy it onto like a email, and I will send you Ann's email. Ann is very, she's a producer, so she's very approachable. And you can send her questions. Can't you like download chats once the groups are over? Isn't that something that you can do once the meetings are over?
One of my classes have done that.
I can have Donovan email you a list of emails if that works better. I feel like that would work better.
Great, yeah. So you can drop your emails in the chat. Donovan will send them to me. And I will send to you Ann's email. And feel free to ask Ann anything, because I already asked Ann ahead of time. Hey, I'm going to talk a bit about producers, but I'm not a producer. So they might have questions for you. She'll get you into shape. I mean, she will tell you, especially about contracts and conflict management. She will tell you this is stuff that I would suggest. Yeah, that's what I would recommend. That's all that I really have. And then one last thing I'll say is, get Ann for a talk. Honestly, if Ann responds, if Leila or Donovan, if y'all reach out to Ann and you like what's being said, bring Ann in. She will happily talk. She's great. She puts us to work. And she's from Riverside as well. She did film. She did PA stuff. She did a bunch of production over there. So she's sort of a jack of all trades. Okay, so what was I going to say? The last thing I'll say for everybody is there is an article that came out about Josh Sawyer. He developed a game called Pillars of Eternity. The first one was a cult classic. The second one came out and flopped, but the critical reception is amazing. Like up in the 90s, everyone who did play it loved it, but it didn't sell and nobody knows why. And I think that this article that came out, I don't remember the name of the article, but I would just Google Deadfire, Josh Sawyer, and you're going to find it. It's a recent article about game development, and it's about how it just didn't work out and nobody knows why. And I think it's important to just see those things as a creative and to remind yourself that you have to love what you're doing, regardless of other people loving it, or is it going to sell, or are you going to be like the next big game artist? Are you going to be the guy who makes the next Last of Us, right? Because he's like considered a big name, the guy who developed that. So yeah, that's what I would suggest. That's what I would leave you with. It's a bit of it sounds cynical, but once you're finished reading it, you'll see what I mean. It's just Josh Sawyer saying, we have no idea why it didn't succeed. But it doesn't matter. It's a great game. So yeah. If you have any more questions, Donovan, you can send people my email. I will happily answer. But I hope you all have an amazing weekend. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to meet with us. It was a really, I don't know, I thought this was a really fun talk. I hope the rest of you guys also had fun too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
I
gonna
thought it
stop
was
it.
incredible.